Okay, so we're gonna probably have a lot of glare because it's nighttime and I have to have like my lights on. I'm sorry if that's bothersome, but I need to see more than I need to not have glare. So hey folks, my name is Jen and today I'm going to talk with you about all of the books that I read in October. So in October I read 11 books. So a good chunk of the books that I read were for the Boo to You Readathon, which is put on by Bookish Princess every year, and for once I managed to finish a readathon. So let's just get into the books and we'll go chronologically by how I read them, as per usual. So the first book, or actually the first couple of books that I read, were not for the Boo to You Readathon. They were books that I was just reading in general. First of those was After the Funeral by Agatha Christie. This was actually a reread because I was in the mood for a mystery novel, and this was kind of a comfort read. Agatha Christie ends up being a comfort read with me sometimes. So this is following the events that take place after the funeral of old Richard Abernethy. His remaining family come back to the estate to honor his memory, and at the reception at the old family home afterwards, his remaining sister says the words, "It's been hushed up very nicely, hasn't it? But he was murdered, wasn't he?" And that sets off a chain of events which includes her very gruesome death. The old family solicitor ends up consulting one of his old friends, Mr. Hercule Poirot, to help solve the mystery. So I felt that this was a case of Poirot being at his best. He's brilliant, he's at times a bit funny, and he's just very careful in his ways of letting the little gray cells unravel the various clues of this mystery. Was Richard actually murdered? And if he was, or if he wasn't, who thought his sister Cora needed to be shut up? I enjoyed Poirot's part in this immensely. I enjoyed the whole thing immensely, actually. I really like when there are interesting family dynamics in stories, especially in these murder mysteries, when Agatha Christie has them set at like an old manor house. And sometimes, and in some of her older books, sometimes the manor house is still like functioning as an old manor house and the family are all living around each other, and sometimes, such as the case in this book, it is taking place a little later. And the manor is going to be sold off. The family no longer lives there. Maybe there's like one or two people that still reside in the house. It's kind of spread out. Nobody can afford to like stay there anymore. They don't really have servants anymore. Maybe there's only like a couple left. It's a different look at what it used to be. And there's a lot of reflection on the nostalgia of everything and the really interesting family dynamics of everyone, basically, how screwed up they might be, or rather dysfunctional families. I think Agatha Christie does really well, especially showing their relationships with each other and with outside parties. And yeah, I think that's just an element that she always does very well in her mysteries and makes them very compelling. I thought this was a brilliant conclusion, to be honest. I guessed who the killer was, and I was correct, but I didn't understand the motive because I missed a couple of key details that she'd had in there. But it was just absolutely brilliant, and I really enjoyed this, and I thought this was a fairly fun read. And I gave this 5 stars. The next book I read was one that I have actually been rereading as like my book of choice at work, and that was The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. So this is following disgraced journalist Mikael Blomkvist, as he has recently been sentenced to some jail time for libel. He is, before his jail time needs to be completed, however, he is contacted by the head of the very rich and famous Wenger family, who wants Mikael to research and solve the mystery of what happened to his niece Harriet when she disappeared back in the 1960s. Mikael is at first a little bit reluctant to do something like this. He is not a detective, he is just a journalist. However, he becomes intrigued by the mystery and soon enlists the help of this kind of punk, tattooed, brilliant hacker named Elizabeth Salander. This is an absolutely action-packed mystery. A good chunk of this involves like research into a family and like specific goings on. It also involves a lot of discussion about financial stuff as relating to like Sweden in general and Swedish culture. And as confusing as that can be at times, especially honestly for someone who barely understands how our financial stuff works in this country, especially with like stocks and our own like Wall Street shit and things like that, you would think that having to listen to whole chunks of writing about how stocks and bonds and finances work in like Sweden would be like just completely over my head. But Stieg Larsson managed to make those still like interesting and compelling parts of this story. And if there's anything that I can't really get and I just want to skim over, honestly, you can kind of skim it over a little bit. It's important, but not like overly important to the plot, basically. This is, other than that, at times quite dark and twisted. There are a few scenes within here and tidbits here and there which at times I almost felt like on this read through maybe they were made for like a shock factor perhaps, which bothered me a bit, especially considering that some of that shock factor has to do with violence against women. On the other hand, the like certain details and things that the author said in here, as well as there's facts that he has throughout here in certain sections of the book, like different parts. For example, 18% of the women in Sweden have at one time been threatened by a man. And he just has these facts in here. And that partnered with some of the things that are addressed in here help it. Of course, the author has passed, so it's like you can't really ask him. Or I don't think there's not really any interviews, I don't think, with him about this stuff, because I believe he passed before these were published. But just those little bits and certain things that he says in here, I believe that he was trying to go for a shock factor, but he wasn't trying to be like an edgelord about it or anything. What he was trying to do was bring an awareness to violence against women and against vulnerable people in Sweden, and things that have been done in the past and things that are still happening, and trying to draw attention to it so that it can make people think more about it, really, and maybe make a change. I think that's basically what he was going through in here. I don't think those were done just for entertainment, like titillating things. I think they were done to try to bring awareness to it and have like a different kind of message basically for it. With that said, I do have to say that there are some bits in here. There are sections that go into detail about physical and sexual abuse against characters, so just keep that in mind if that is something that you are particularly sensitive to, that comes up in here quite a few times. There's also pretty gruesome descriptions of violence against like killing of women and animals in here, so keep that in mind too. I thought that this book is like an interesting look at a culture that I honestly don't really know that much about. I think so getting to read this, which is more matter of fact because it's set there, it's written by someone who was Swedish and who lived there. It's just a very nice everyday look at this country and their people, basically. I really like that there are gray area characters in here. Like a lot of the characters, there's definitely some real jerkwads in here. But there's also a lot of people where it's like you kind of like them, but at the same time, they're not the greatest of people either. And I kind of like that. Sometimes gray area characters really frustrate me in books, but I don't really mind them in here because there's reasons why they are the way they are. And sometimes those reasons are valid and sometimes I don't think they're valid, but it's understandable why they are the way that they are. Also, I really enjoy Lisbeth. I think she is a total badass and a very interesting take on like the avenging angel trope sort of thing. I enjoy her very much. I have started reading The Girl Who Played with Fire, which is book 2, and I have some thoughts, but I'll get around to those thoughts when I eventually finish that book. Overall, though, I really enjoyed this reread, and yeah, like I said, it makes boring things about like finances and money fascinating. And yeah, it's just an absolutely action-packed thriller. So I give this 5 stars. Then the next book I read was The Shining by Stephen King. This was the first book that I finished for the Booty You Readathon. This was for the prompt that I believe had to do with like ghostly ghouls popping out to greet you with ghoulish delight or some kind of thing like that. But having like a grand party, like whatever that quote is from the song, that's what this was for, because it reminded me of later on in the book when there's like a masquerade scene and stuff like that. Oh, this, of course, if you don't know, is about the Torrance family, Jack, Wendy, and their young son, Danny. Jack has been hired to be the winter caretaker for the Grand Overlook Hotel in Colorado. Basically, the winter caretaker has to live there over the winter, obviously, and just be there as like a last line of defense against nature. They're there to keep the boiler running so that pipes don't burst, so that the hotel doesn't incur more damage as things break. He's there to fix it, take care of it, do the upkeep, so everything's all good by the time springtime rolls around and the roads open up because the snow is finally gone. So Jack, who basically is a major fuck up, is on his last chance to do something right, basically. So he moves up there with his wife Wendy and their 5-year-old son Danny, and the thing is that the hotel has its own demons on top of the inner demons that the Torrances are bringing to it. And the thing is, the evil shit in the hotel is very interested in the Torrances, and especially very interested in young Danny, who happens to be quite psychic. I annotated this time. Some annotation ASMR. I feel like I've mentioned this before, but this is one of my all-time favorite books. annotating this did so much more for me than it has previously. I have read this now, I think, 6 times, I want to say. It's something like that, and I feel like I got a lot out of it the previous times I read this, but I got even more out of it this time, annotating everything. My annotations basically were, I had tabs for literary references, or signs of love, favorite lines, colloquialisms, or like childhood things, the setting as a character, foreshadowing or connections with like things later on in the book, things with Dr. Sleep, things with like other books, movie things, so like things that, scenes that were particularly good or were focused on in the movie adaptation by Kubrick, then like the creepy and evil, violent and spooky, all that stuff, and then also character traits. So basically that's everything that I like notated on, made notes on, commented on throughout my reading of this, and I feel like doing that really helped me kind of understand more the thought that went behind this book, breaking down certain little things that like King does, like that I've noticed in here, but is also stuff that I've noticed he's done in like other works of his, and it really made me notice or keep an eye out for the little foreshadowing things, or little Easter eggs basically, that King put in here, that have to do with very specific things that happen later at like the climax of the book, or certain things that tie it in to his other works. Basically, things that I noticed that I remembered were in Dr. Sleep that played a role in Dr. Sleep, which is the sequel, which I think were just brilliantly done. I just really enjoyed this. This is so much more than a horror book. While there are certain scenes of here that are quite horrific, and there are some things that happen which are rather grotesque or disturbing, or upsetting, it just goes far beyond just a horror book. This is basically a family tragedy, and it's harder to look at some of the good and happy scenes when you know shit's gonna get crazy later. Ended up disliking Jack more this go around because I just did a way more in-depth reading into like his character traits and certain things, things that he says, things that he does, like attitudes of his and stuff like that. So I ended up disliking him a lot more and feeling less sorry for him than I had previously, but I also felt like maybe I felt more overall for the characters in this read through because I went so in depth into breaking down their character traits and seeing like the pieces that add up to basically destruction. There's a couple of lines that hit home really, really hard in here. I don't want to continue like talking a ton about this because I have a few other books to go into, but I am planning on having a separate video where I go into an in-depth chat about this book and comparing it to the Kubrick adaptation. So yeah, I will go way more in depth about my thoughts and feelings about this overall at that time. But I really enjoyed this reread, and I gave this 5 stars. Next book I finished basically for the readathon had to do with the prompt of welcome to the Haunted Mansion, I'm your ghost host, like that whole thing. For that I chose to read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I bought a physical copy because I actually listened to the audiobook for it which I enjoyed immensely. The narrator was like fantastic. It was really good. But I decided that, you know what, I want a physical copy because the next time I read this, I think I'm actually going to annotate this as well. I got a really nice copy. I did not know that I was getting this nice a copy, honestly, when I got this. I thought I was just getting, you know, a decent one. But anyway, this is following a group of characters who are headed off to Hill House, which is this reportedly haunted mansion, to do a study, basically, on whether or not this place is indeed haunted. And the people who were chosen to go here have either had psychic things happen or are kind of into like the whole paranormal stuff. This is led by Dr. Montague, who is a paranormal like researcher, essentially. And this book kind of follows their time there, especially closely following the somewhat unreliable narrator, Eleanor. Props, of course, have to be given to the opening of this book. The opening paragraph, which is, "No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years, and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm, and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone." Like, what opening is that? Sets the stage. Creepy. So, like I said, the audiobook I read had like a really great narrator. I definitely enjoy that. This is hopelessly spooky and incredibly unsettling. Like, unlike the more recent adaptations, like the 1999 film version, The Haunting, starring Catherine Zeta-Jones, Liam Neeson, Owen Wilson, and Liv Tyler, or the recent television adaptation, The Haunting of Hill House, which terrified me so much I like had to sleep with the light on for ages and jumped at every shadow. There are no jump scares in this book. There's no literary jump scares. There are unsettling and unexplainable things that happen, but this book overall is not like outwardly horrifying, but at the same time it is so unsettling. It's extremely atmospheric. It leaves you feeling off kilter the whole time you're reading it. What's real? What isn't real? Nell as an unreliable narrator, it just makes this book. It is so odd, and I think that's what makes it so troubling, is because it's so odd. Shirley Jackson is really good at being unsettling. I've only ever read this book of hers and The Lottery, which horrified the hell out of me back in high school. I do plan on trying to read more of her stuff at some point. But this is just overall unsettling. It is a very beautifully written book too. There are so many subtleties in here, which is why I said I wanted a physical copy so I can, on the next time I plan to read this, annotate this, because I want to break it down a little more and pick up more on those subtleties that I really noticed a lot more when I was listening to the audiobook this time. It's just very brilliant. I do have to say that the thing that makes me more infuriated this book are the inclusion of a couple of characters. Namely Mrs. Montague, Dr. Montague's wife, and her friend Arthur, who, they're both the worst people, and this might be a spoiler, but I really wish the house ate them. Like, that's my one disappointment with this book, is that the house didn't fucking eat them, because they are, like, I almost hate them as much as I hate Dolores Umbridge, and that is saying a lot, because that is a character that if she was a real person, I would light that bitch on fire. So for me to say that I hate these people about as much as I hate her, that's like huge, huge. But overall, I really enjoyed this read through. I'm glad I grabbed a physical copy of it. And yeah, I gave this 4 stars. The next book I read was also for the Bougie Readathon. It had to do with, like, talking about candlelit something or other in, like, doorless chamber, not doorless chambers. Creepy, like, have to do with the atmosphere of the Haunted Mansion, basically. That was the prompt. So for that, I read Ghostly Tales and Eerie Poems of Edgar Allan Poe. So, firstly, I guess I'll just go shortly through everything that was in here. So the first 2 stories were Message Found in a Bottle and Morella. I did not really enjoy either of those, to be honest. I didn't find either of them very interesting or spooky. I DNF'd the tale Ligeia because it had to do, from what it sounded like, with another protagonist who was in love with this very intelligent, beautiful, and yet delicate flower of a woman who he watched waste away and then pined after her corpse, and maybe she did or did not come back to life with her undead corpse thing. And it put me off. I just couldn't be bothered to read another story about that, so I just ended up DNFing it. I also DNF'd the short story The Black Cat, and that had to do with animal abuse that happened, and I just could not be arsed to finish reading that story. However, I did read, let's see, William Wilson. I'm not 100% sure what happened in that story, to be honest. The Fall of the House of Usher was deliciously creepy and exactly kind of what I was looking for. The Oval Portrait and The Pit and the Pendulum, and also The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, those were all that were a little bit unsettling, but not, like, overly terrifying. I could see why, though, at the time when Poe was writing them, why they would particularly horrify his audience, but as someone who, I guess, is a little desensitized to some horror, I didn't find them particularly horrifying. They were a little unsettling, but not anything that was overly scary. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, I was particularly interested in that one because I had heard on podcasts that I've been listening to that this was, like, one of the first, like, locked room mysteries, so I was really excited to read that and see the solution and everything, and I didn't really know what to think about it. While I did very much enjoy it, the solution to the crime was so freaking hilarious, and the thing is that I don't think it was meant to be hilarious. I think it was meant to be particularly clever and kind of spooky, but I just laughed my butt off at it because it was so utterly freaking out of left field and ridiculous that I don't know. I think I enjoyed it because it amused me greatly, but it was definitely not what I was expecting. I do still recommend it, though. The Telltale Heart is one that I understand why people get freaked out about it. That's another one that I found really amusing, and I thought that it was an interesting look at someone who has clearly gone round the bend. Like, they have lost their damn mind, and it's definitely an interesting study in someone who has slowly lost it, just completely and utterly gone mad. So I liked it for that. Hop Frog was a very different kind of tale. That was very unexpected. I think it felt a little different to me than Poe's usual things that were the rest of the stories in here, but I think I kind of liked it too, based on how it ended. I think I enjoyed that. That was, again, a story that kind of felt out of left field, but I did really enjoy it. As for The Mask of the Red Death and The Cask of Amontillado, those are two stories that I read previously. Mask of the Red Death I read when I was, I want to say maybe 9, and it really freaked me out because I was absolutely terrified of the Black Plague. Why, as a 9-year-old in the 90s, I would have been so terrified of the Black Plague, which has not been a thing in centuries, I don't know, but it was something that I lived in great fear of for quite a while after reading that story, and although it didn't terrify me like I remember it doing when I was a small child and probably shouldn't have been reading Poe at the time, I did really enjoy it. I think it was very atmospheric. And The Cask of Amontillado, I think I read that for the first time back in like junior high, and I remember really enjoying it. I love a good revenge story, as you've probably heard me when I talked about The Count of Monte Cristo when I read it earlier this year, and something about that, even though it's quite unhinged, I just enjoyed it, and I enjoyed revisiting it again. As far as the poems go, overall his poems they're just not my cup of tea. They're just not really something that I particularly enjoy reading. It's not a style that I'm like super into. I just don't think that Gothic literature overall is something that I will be reaching for a lot of, and I also don't think that Gothic poetry is not really so much something that I enjoy. I feel like it's very overly dramatic, and it's not quite as flowery as, say, Shelley or Keats or anything, but it's got certain elements to it that it's just not my cup of tea. If you like it, that's wonderful for you. If you like that kind of like overly dramatic, descriptive kind of stuff, I think you'll really enjoy his poetry, but I don't know, it wasn't something that I overly enjoyed. The City and the Sea, The Sleeper, Lenore, Olaloom for Annie, Annabelle Lee, The Bells, they were all kind of like that, and it was just like, The Raven, again, that overdramatic thing too, but it's such a classic, and I have read it before, and I've also heard it like read before. I think it honestly improves more when someone performs it, to be honest. But it's unsettling, and I did enjoy it. I also particularly liked the artwork that went along with it. And yeah, it's a classic. It delights. I think my favorite out of the poems was Alone, which is the last thing in the book, and that was a poem that I particularly enjoyed back in high school, because it was at I don't remember if I mentioned this in the TBR video, but that was like a poem that was at the beginning of a book that I really liked at the time, which had to do with vampires and was called Demon in My View. And the title is based off of part of a line in Alone, and I don't know, I was super like into vampires and werewolves and goth shit back then, so like that went right along with like my angsty teenage bullshit that I really loved at the time. And there's still like a little bit of an angsty 15-year-old living inside of me, so I did enjoy revisiting that poem and looking at it again as an adult. So yeah, overall, I did like this, and I do think that while it's not very creepy, it's extremely atmospheric. And if you want to have that get in the creepy kind of spooky mood, I think this is really good for that. But it's not horrifying. But it is still interestingly written, and I think Poe was very good at creating a mood. So yeah, I ended up giving this 4 stars overall. The next thing I read was also for the Boo Do You Readathon, and this has to do with like the part of the song that has to do with like ghouls and witches. The part of the song that has to do with the witches making the little spell thingy mahooge, whatever it is. And for that I read Witch Witch by Eva Ibbotson. This is about Ahriman the Awful, who is the awfulest wizard in the world, and there was a prophecy told several years ago that he should wait for the next great wizard who is going to come and who he is going to train to take over for him when he retires. And he has spent years waiting for this wizard to show up until eventually some of his household, his servants, point out to him that maybe what the prophecy meant was that he needs to get married and have kids, and that those will be the next great wizards that will be even greater than him, that will take over for him when he retires. So he is now on the search for a witchy wife, and he's basically put out this call for the witches of Todcaster, where he was born, to compete for his hand, basically. He wants to marry the witch who creates the darkest piece of magic that she can. That will be the one that he chooses, basically. So all the witches of Todcaster have come together, including young sweet Belladonna, who happens to be a white witch and also happens to be hopelessly in love with Ahriman the Awful. Her spells end up creating begonias and baby birds and attracting sweet little woodland creatures, not so much the boils and scorpions and rats and things that she'd like to create. What the heck can one sweet witch possibly do to catch the attention and win the heart of the worst wizard in the world? This was great. I had read this when I was younger, and I thought that the memory I had of it was that I didn't overly enjoy it. So I was a little apprehensive coming into this book again, but I have to say that I really love this. The humor is so deliciously British. It reminded me, in a sense, it reminded me a little bit of Roald Dahl, and also a little bit of the Nevermore series. There were like bits in there that were just very funny and, like I said, like deliciously British humor. Like there's a very specific humor, especially when they write for kids, that is there, and it's something that I really loved as a kid and still as an adult really get tickled by, and I laughed out loud quite a few times while I was reading this. I really enjoyed it. The witch and wizard tropes are overly abundant in here, and while they could be something that you could roll your eyes over, I love them. They were absolutely ridiculous and over the top, but very humorous at the same time, and I really enjoyed it. I loved the tongue-in-cheek humor. I loved the societal, commentary kind of sprinkled here and there and I just really enjoyed this. This was so magical and super cute. There's also, a found family trope in here, which is, I've said it before, but it is honestly one of my favorite tropes of all time, and I love that it was included in here too, and I just had a wonderful, wonderful time revisiting this book. I think that I want to try to find some of this author's other works in the future because I just want to read more of this. Yeah, I loved this and I gave this 5 stars. The next book I read was not for the readathon, but was a book that I just felt like finishing because I started this a couple of months ago and then set it aside. So that was Mandy by Julie Andrews Edwards. Yes, that Julie Andrews. Sound of Music, Julie Andrews. Follows Mandy, who is a 10-year-old girl. She is an orphan, and all she really wants is a place that she can call home, a place that is just her. She's so sick of having to share everything, be constantly around all of these other children, and she really desperately wants her own home. One day she ends up sneaking over the garden wall and wandering through the woods behind the orphanage, and she comes across this little abandoned cottage, which has very cute and sometimes also beautiful features, including this room that is basically like decorated in shells. It's like really pretty. So she decides that she is going to fix this place up and have a place to call her own. But in her strive for independence, Mandy comes across a couple of not so great situations, and it's at that time when she figures out who her friends are and who she can rely on. The idea of a little girl making like a place all her own in nature is just so cute. This is like a very specific kind of niche things that I enjoy, and is something that I've been really craving over the past couple of years. I don't know what it is. I didn't read some of these books when I was a kid, so now I'm reaching for them, I guess. Trying to connect with that like little kid me who would have loved to like live in the woods and do this kind of like stuff, but as an adult it's like, oh hell no. I don't know, I really have been loving that recently, and that's an aspect of this that I really liked. This was at times a little bit sad, but it's also very sweet that all she wants basically is a place of her very own. I do have to admit though, the first half of this book was quite a big slog going through this, even though there were bits of this that I really liked, like her connecting with the animals around the cottage, her getting the cottage together. Like, there are parts of it that I really enjoyed. I think the big bits that I had to slog through were the bits having to do with the orphanage that she lives in and the characters there and her interactions with the people there. Like, I was just kind of like, I don't know, like those bits I didn't enjoy as much basically, but I was very emotionally invested in the second half of the story, and yeah, overall I think this was a very emotional story and I really loved it, and the ending made me cry, and like, yeah, I ended up really enjoying this. I gave this 4 stars. The next book I read was actually an audiobook, and that was Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers. This was a reread. I had read this previously back in like high school, I want to say. This is the first book in the Lord Peter Wimsey series, and it is following Lord Peter Wimsey when he is pulled into a mystery by a family friend who, this like rather unassuming architect who one day wakes up and finds a naked dead man in his bathtub. Well, not completely naked. The man is wearing a pince-nez, or pince-nez. I've heard it pronounced 2 different ways. I'm not entirely sure how it's pronounced, but it's basically that little, like, eyeglass thingy, perched on his nose. So, yeah. Lord Peter Wimsey investigates. So I really like this audiobook. I think it was a well done reading. I will try to find a link to that too and leave it down below, or at least I'll find the name of whoever read it and I'll leave that for you in the description box down below. But yeah, I think it was very well done, and I really kind of enjoyed it. I felt like this read through, I think the first time I was more noticing how arrogant and ridiculous that a couple of the characters were, but on this read through I felt like there was way more depth to the characters than I noticed on my previous read. There are bits about bigotry in here being addressed very slightly, and there's also bits about like Lord Peter's shell shock that he has to deal with left over from World War I that I think hit home more, really, and I think really added depth overall to the story and to the characters. And overall the characters are just really entertaining, especially Whimsy's butler, Bunter. He is fascinated with photography and really knows his stuff, and he's a great assistant to Whimsy. And I think that their kind of partnership reminds me a little bit of Jeeves and Wooster, only less comedy, but Bunter is definitely just as capable as Jeeves is in the P.G. Wodehouse books, and I think he was my favorite character out of the bunch, to be honest. Overall, I think that was a very interesting book. There were a couple of parts that were kind of hard to read because they might be a little upsetting, basically if you're feeling for a couple of the characters that were involved in there, but still, I really enjoyed it. I think it was very well done, and I gave that book 5 stars. We have a visitor. Right, Beans? Say hi. Say hi. She's not impressed. So this next one is also for the Booty Readathon, and I ended up actually switching it out because the prompt that I used had to do with like doorless banks. Don't do that. It had to do with like doorless chambers, and originally I had picked The Institute by Stephen King. I was going to use that one because it involves sort of a doorless chamber, rather a locked like room that the children at this institute are basically locked in. And I ended up just not getting to it because it was like the last week of the month and it's just so thick, and I knew that I wasn't going to be able to get through it, and I felt bad because I never managed to finish readathons. I always managed to be short by a book or two because I just run out of time because shit happens. And I really wanted to feel like I'd accomplished something recently, so I ended up switching out from that book to a reread of Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. It's a locked room mystery, so I figured, hey, this fits in pretty perfectly with the prompt still, or how I interpreted it, basically. So that's what I did. Is it slightly cheating? Maybe, but I don't care. So yeah, so I ended up doing a reread of this book. This is one of my all-time favorite books. And honestly, I think it is probably my favorite of Agatha Christie's, although Crooked House is a close second to being a favorite of mine, of hers. So if you don't know, especially considering how popular this has been because of the movie recently that came out a few years ago, but this is following Hercule Poirot. He is on his way home from solving a great case in... I actually don't remember where. I don't remember where he was when he solved the case. Was it Syria? Maybe. Helped with this big case somewhere, and he is on his way back to England because something is happening there and he has to rush back. So he ends up managing to squeeze onto the Orient Express. It is fully packed during the winter, which is like completely unheard of, and he's just very struck by you know, this packed train, and unfortunately the train gets stuck in a snowdrift in the middle of the night, and when he wakes up in the morning, he sees he ends up getting called into one of the other like berths on the train because a rather nasty-ish man has been murdered in the night in a locked berth, basically. So now it's up to Poirot to figure out why this happened and who exactly did it. In my opinion, Poirot is at his best in this book. I really, like I said, this is like my favorite that he is in, basically. And yeah, I think this is the best one that he's in my humble opinion. I really enjoy it. I think he's at his best here. He's intelligent, he's funny, he's charming, he's brilliant. His little gray cells are just on point. I really adored this. I do have to say, I feel like I haven't quite seen an adaptation yet where the person playing Poirot gets Poirot correct. Because, I mean, Kenneth Branagh as Poirot in the movie that came out a few years ago was okay, or closer to how it seems like Poirot is in the book. I recently watched the David Suchet version that I hadn't seen before, and normally I love him as Poirot and I think he is Poirot, but in this particular adaptation, I did not like it at all. I don't think he played Poirot the way that he's played in the book. This is me being a stickler for it. I know there are a couple of other versions, I believe, that were made in like the 70s or something like that. So I'm going to try to watch those and see if I feel differently about those. Like maybe one of those guys got Poirot portrayed correctly like he is in this. Like, because everybody seems to go like dark with him for this one, but that's not how he is behaving in the book at all. So I don't know where they're getting this from, but whatever. Anyway, this is me bitching about stuff that doesn't matter with the book necessarily. I am just saying that in this, I think he is brilliant and pretty great. I love this book. I think it's a brilliant locked room mystery. I think that it has clever characters and a really interesting setup. I love trains. I've probably mentioned this before. I'm a sucker for trains. I'm a nerd for trains. I think they are fascinating. I wish that I had more opportunities to ride on trains. I, at times, kind of wish that trains were a big a transportation thing here as they are in like Europe. I think they're fun. I think they're interesting. I get really excited about old trains. It's just a thing. Old trains, train sets, model train. I'm like all about it. I think it's a topic that I'm very interested in. So when there's a setting involving a train, like there is especially a murder mystery having to do with trains, love it. So I just love the setting of it. I love the setup, how things are set up, how the characters are. I think they're all very interesting. It's a very diverse cast, and I like the little glimpses that we get at each of them. They're very interesting characters, and I found the conclusion is just something that I really love overall. And yeah, I love this book. It's my favorite mystery, hands down, and I love it. I give it 5 stars. The next book I read is a recent purchase, and that is the book of Cymbeline, A Kitten's Tale from Summer to Fall, written and illustrated by Emma Stewart, aka Bookish Princess. So she had her like announcement recently that she made this and it was going to be up online, and I ended up buying it. This is basically the illustrated tale, which follows the true story of a tiny kitten who appeared unexpectedly in a tree hollow one September day. And this is basically all about the author finding this kitten when she knows nothing about cats, basically, and really learning how to take care of her and stuff. It's really cute. I think this is a very charming story. I think, yeah, it has the cute little personality of the kitten and the little anxieties of the author being like, oh my gosh, there's a tiny little life that I'm like responsible for now and stuff. And I found this to be very cute overall. I also really liked the artwork. I think the artwork was really colorful and also very charming as well. I love the little like facial expressions on Cymbeline the kitten. This one's my favorite. It's such a cat pose and it's so cute. But yeah, I think overall this is really cute. I also really liked getting more, because if you watch her videos on BookTube, you'll have seen like stuff about Cymbeline before, but I liked seeing a little bit more about like when she first got Cymbeline and kind of adjusting to that, to having like a kitten and stuff like that. And personally, I also kind of connected with this in a way because my husband and I ourselves, like we already had a cat that we adopted, but he was already mostly grown when we adopted him. And, you know, my husband and I, we've grown up in families with cats before, but I don't think we've had, like, kittens, like, legitimately had kitten, or maybe his family's had kittens, but I've never had, like, legit kitten ever. All the cats I've ever had or been around have all been grown cats. And we, during the fall of 2020, had a kitten that got abandoned in our backyard. And we ended up, with the help of a friend, trapping her and, you know, taking her in and deciding to, like, keep her. She's so cute. She's my little baby that you just saw before. And that was, like, a new experience. Because you know cats, if you've had cats, but having, like, a tiny baby kitten who was, like, 2 months old, that was just, like, a whole entire new experience to have a kitten that young. And so, and all, like, the anxieties that come along with that. So I really kind of connected with that part of that too, because personally we also found a kitten fairly recently that we had to, like, you know, bring into our lives and come into our home and, like, love her and stuff like that. And so that was just, I don't know, it was an extra element that I also really kind of enjoyed about this book, was like connecting with like the anxieties and the cuteness that kittens are basically, and everything. But this is such a really cute book, and I think it's a good book for kids, but I think it's a good book for anyone. And I also really like the literary references that Emma has in here as well. I gave this 5 stars. And the last book that I read in October was also for the Booty Readathon, so I completed it. And the book was The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Yes! I finally finished it. So this is following the remains of the Pynchon family. The Pynchons, so years ago, a while back, there was a man named Matthew Mall who was a rather kind of poor man, and he had a small cottage on a tract of land in Salem. And this man named Colonel Pynchon, who was rich and had the right connections, basically wanted that land, and Matthew Mall would not sell. So Colonel Pynchon ended up arranging for him to be accused of witchcraft, of which he was tried and convicted, and before he was hung, Matthew Mall cursed the Pynchon family and the land, basically, and said that God will give you blood to drink. And wouldn't you know it, once the House of the Seven Gables was built upon that land, and Pynchon had gotten a hold of it, Pynchon mysteriously died. Randomly, alone, and totally bloody. So, many years later, this family who wrongfully has the land on which the House of Seven Gables is built. They've had some misfortunes here and there, and currently some of the branch of the family, namely Hepzibah and her brother Clifford, have the house. It has come into ruin. Their poverty-stricken Hepzibah is forced to open a shop in the front of the house to make any kind of ends meet, basically. Clifford has been away for some time and has recently come back, but he is a shadow of the person he used to be due to circumstances. There's an interesting cast of characters that are involved in this, including a young country cousin named Phoebe, who has recently come to the house to stay, a mysterious daguerreotypist. I am not gonna pronounce this correctly. Basically, he is a lodger that they have in the house, named Holgrave, and then you also have Hepzibah and Clifford's shitty-ass cousin, the Judge Pynchon, Joffrey. If that sounds complicated, I don't know how to explain this better without giving things away, which is basically how they do on the back of the book. It basically has to do with this family home, and are the Pynchons cursed? Are they not cursed? If they are cursed, are they going to break the curse? Like, how's that going to work? Yeah, there's a lot going on here. So, some lines in this book I think really hit home for me. There's a lot of observations about society that are very interesting. Nathaniel Hawthorne himself was, I believe, from what I remember of what I know about him, was himself feeling kind of guilty about things that his family was responsible for. He had a relative of the Hawthorne family who featured in the Salem witch trials, and the guilt of his family's association with that horrific series of events was something that he carried with him like his whole life, and it's why I believe he has like these kind of examinations of Puritan culture and how it still affects our culture, especially when Hawthorne was alive, but looking at it now and how the remnants of it still kind of are in our culture here in this country, which is absolutely insane. That's like hundreds of years ago. Who the fuck cares anymore? But it's definitely interesting, and you can see that really in House of Seven Gables and also in The Scarlet Letter. How he kind of dealt with that guilt by writing about it and kind of having like the societal like commentary on this and on groups of people and stuff like that behaving in certain ways, and it's interesting. It's definitely a lot to think about. There's a line here that particularly hit home with me fairly well partway through the book, and it's kind of talking about Hepzibah and her brother Clifford feeling like they could try to join society again after many years of having been kind of reclusive and out of it, and how they feel about that, and how they feel about whether or not they can even attempt it. And something that said there, basically they felt like they could not really step outside into society, and the lines are, for what other dungeon is so dark as one's own heart? What jailer so inexorable as one's self? And that just, as someone who not really, I've never really had agoraphobia or anything, but I've definitely had social anxiety to the point of at a couple of different points in my life, I've been exceptionally anxious being out amongst people in general, in public entirely, or just being kind of out on my own and stuff like that. And as someone who has dealt with that and still deals with a fair amount of anxiety at some points, it just, it really kind of hit home a lot, those lines about, you know, you being your own jailer so much. It's not so much society sometimes, it's how you view society viewing you. And the own stuff that goes on in your own head and heart. And it's just, whew, that's a lot. So there are certain lines like that that really hit home, societal observances that I really I found amusing or still very relatable, even though this was written like many, many years ago, still relatable to how, you know, people are now, and it was just very interesting. There was a chapter in here that I wasn't really sure what the point of it was exactly. So Holgrave, the lodger, has decided to delve into the history of the Pynchons a little bit, and he has decided to do some writing about the history of them. And it's this chapter which basically is his story, or what he's written of his story about the Pynchons, involving their family history and stuff. And I didn't really understand the point of that chapter. It felt like it felt like it wasn't really necessary to the plot, or a couple of the things, the potential that really happened in it could have been summarized or explained in another way. It didn't feel like we needed that whole chapter of his random narrative. Like it just didn't feel like that was particularly necessary overall to the story. And there were some bits in it involving a slave that the Pynchon family had at the time, and it was a big stereotype and also kind of racist, and that also was like, I get it, that's how people like wrote at the time because they were rude, but it kind of felt like that didn't do anything to push the plot further anymore, other than just Hawthorne randomly sticking a caricature of a black person at the time, or what, like I said, a caricature of what people assumed black people were like at the time, and just kind of put that in there for no reason in a chapter which was not called for. Like the chapter itself, I feel like it didn't really add anything to the plot overall. It showed us a couple more characters from the past, but overall, like I said, I don't think it was really necessary. And if any of that information was needed by any chance, or Hawthorne felt he had to put it in, he could have done it in a different way than he did it. Like, we didn't need this sudden break in the story to be in the voice of Holgrave telling this freaking short story he wrote. Like, it wasn't necessary, really. So that was something that kind of detracted from this overall. And the ending kind of bothered me as well. It felt like everything wrapped up a little bit too perfectly. It felt like everything was just too mystically, perfectly wrapped up in this beautiful little perfect package full of BS. There was some omnipotence going on with a couple of the characters, and it just, everything felt like it fell into place a little bit far too neatly. So there was one particular element of the ending that I did really enjoy, because it's something that I always enjoy in stories, but I won't mention that because it's kind of a spoiler. I think even if I try to be vague about it, it's going to be a spoiler, so I'm just not going to, like, try. There's a chapter right near the end, before everything's neatly wrapped up, that was it was like really full of like sarcasm, and I kind of enjoyed it. It was really weird. It was a kind of a meta chapter, but I did kind of like it too. It was interesting. It was different than the rest of the book a little bit, but I enjoyed it. It was really dark. And eerie, and I liked it. For the rest of it, like, interesting descriptions, very atmospheric. I did really enjoy some of the characters. They were interesting. But yeah, that neat ending and the chapter that did not need to exist, those kind of like took away from my enjoyment of this read overall. I did still find it to be an interesting read, but because of those elements to it, I don't know, it makes me a little bit nervous to do a reread of Scarlet Letter because I'm like, oh man, am I not gonna like my reread of that, or am I still gonna find that enjoyable? I don't know. I did end up giving this like 3 stars though, but yeah, I'm glad I finally finished reading it though. I do have to say. And if you're ever in Salem, Massachusetts, you should definitely go visit the House of Seven Gables because the tour is great. The tour guides there are just wonderful and really informative, and it's also a really cool looking house. So, but yeah, so that is everything that I read in the month of October. So I finished a readathon and read a few more books, so that was pretty good overall. Yeah, pretty good chunk of shit that I read. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts on them were. Let me know how your reading month was. I hope it was really good. I hope your month right now is going really good. If you would like to subscribe, please do so. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you for always watching, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!